The Oxford English Dictionary concludes that the word blizzard is likely an onomatopoeia, created with the same sense that created words like blow and blast and bluster. It was used as early as the 18th century, but it was an uncommon word that did not uniquely refer to winter weather until it became popularized by the press in reference to the winter of 1880 and 81, a winter that was made famous by author Laura Ingalls Wilder's 1940 novel, The Long Winter. Variously called the long winter, the hard winter, the snow winter, the black winter, or the starvation winter. Journalist J. Mark Powell said of it, "If you think you've experienced severe winter weather, no matter how bad it is where you are, it can't hold a candle to this, the mother of all bad winters. It is history that deserves to be remembered." The October blizzard of 1880 across the American Great Plains was, by any measure, exceptional. For one, the storm was early. A June 19, 2020 edition of the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society noted that while October blizzards are fairly rare, they're even rarer in the eastern half of South Dakota. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources describes the blizzard, which struck Minnesota on October 16th, as, to this day, the earliest blizzard in Minnesota history. The storm was particularly devastating because that fall had been, to that point, exceptionally warm. Meteorological records in Yankton, South Dakota had logged an October high of 84 degrees. The highs on October 13th and 14th had been 62 and 58. The weather before the storm was, in fact, quite mild. Author Michelle Morris, writing for the website Heroes, Heroines, and History, explains, "During the summer of 1880, the people of Dakota Territory had no forewarning of the winter to come. The Indian summer lasted into October, and folks were taking their time with final preparations for winter. Hay still needed to be cut, feed corn picked, and firewood gathered. Little did these hardy pioneers know how profoundly a little procrastination would soon affect them." And that effect would be significant. Homesteader Edward Jensen of Grant County, South Dakota later wrote, "The winter came before we were ready for it." John Stanley, editor of the Gary, South Dakota Gary Interstate, later recalled, "It was a glorious autumn season, and we had the farm work well advanced when on October 15th, another date that is unforgettable, a drizzling rain was most acceptable to everyone. It was a pleasant evening within that farm home, with the children all present again and with the welcome rain pattering on the roof and against the windows." But the blizzard was already brewing. The U.S. Weather Service's monthly weather review noted that the depression was centered on Dodge City, Kansas on the morning of the 15th, but during the day the depression decreased rapidly to the north and east of the center, and the storm increased in violence as it moved to the northeast. As a result, heavy snow blockading railway lines was reported in the region between the Mississippi and the Missouri River. The National Weather Service explains in its Weather History Archive, "A violent early-season blizzard devastated Minnesota and the Dakotas. Winds gusted to 70 miles an hour at Yankton, South Dakota, and snowdrifts 10 to 15 feet high were reported in northwest Iowa and southeast South Dakota. Canby, Minnesota reported 20 feet high snowdrifts from this storm." Historian Herbert Schell of the University of South Dakota wrote in his book History of South Dakota, "Mary Paulson, a child of immigrant Norwegian parents in Yellow Medicine County, Minnesota, remembers opening the door on the morning of October 16th to a wall of snow that just fell into the house. Her father had to get up on a chair to make a hole in the snow in order to crawl out of the house. Children were able to slide from the peaks of roofs during breaks in the snow much of the winter. Even substantial two-story homes had snow up to the second-floor windows. No one was prepared for the deep snow so early in the season, and farmers all over the region were caught with their crops to harvest and with fuel supplies low. They had not yet milled their grain or dug out their potatoes when the first blizzard of this snow winter arrived." Professor Margaret Mays Boosted of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, writing in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, explained the cause. "In the October blizzard of 1880, a surface low-pressure system stalled in northwest Iowa and northeast Nebraska. To its northwest, a prolonged period of precipitation combined with a cold air pocket that brought sub-freezing temperatures and gusty winds as a tight pressure gradient persisted. The combination of precipitation at sub-freezing temperatures, snowfall, and strong winds due to a tight pressure gradient likely produced the blizzard conditions. The stalled system allowed snowfall and blowing snow to last for 2 to 3 days in the region. The storm was severe enough to block transportation. A letter by Eliza Jane Wilder, aunt of Laura Ingalls Wilder, held in the National Archives, describes the storm. In October, a blizzard came for 3 days. We could not see an object 10 feet in front of us. The railroads were blocked for 10 days, snow in the cuts being packed like ice. After the storm ceased, I went to town for flour and coal. Our merchants had none. A carload of flour would have been there in a few hours when blockaded. The Canton, South Dakota newspaper, the Canton Advocate, reported, "A terrible snowstorm, probably the worst that southern Dakota ever witnessed, passed over this region of the country, commencing on last Friday with thunder and lightning and continuing until Saturday at midnight. It caused a general suspension of business, blowing down telegraph wires, blockading railroads, the snow drifting to the depth from 15 to 25 feet in cuts along the line of roads." The storm was large. The website Magic Mast and Sturdy Ships explains, "This mid-fall blizzard covered a 500 square mile area, including parts of Nebraska, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and northern Michigan. It deposited several inches of snow on city streets and in the county glens alike, damaged property and destroyed vegetation. On shore in Illinois and Wisconsin, the wind blew at about 125 miles per hour. Only a few inches of snow fell, but the high wind drove it with such force that railway cuts and most roads were packed with drifts. Traffic in Milwaukee and Chicago came to a complete standstill. Rescue parties in sleighs and sleds floundered to stalled trains with food and blankets. The windows in many Milwaukee and Chicago homes were broken by the force of the wind, and many people shivered in front of their fireplaces and coal stoves." It isn't clear how many people died in this blizzard, probably not as many as died in the Great Blizzard of 1888. But there were at least 80 known casualties. The sidewheel steamer Alpena, 197 feet in length with a 26.66-foot beam, was built by Thomas Arnold of Gallagher and Company at Marine City, Michigan in 1866. Operated by the Goodrich Line, the steamer left Grand Haven, Michigan, bound for Chicago on Friday evening, October 15th, at 9:30 p.m. The storm that had puddled the Dakotas struck the Great Lakes on the 16th, where it earned the nickname the Big Blow. It was, according to the website Michigan Shipwrecks, the worst gale in Lake Michigan recorded history. Magic Mast and Sturdy Ships describes the storm. The wind from Nebraska blew around the Alpena as an early morning squall. By the afternoon, the squall had turned into a hurricane, and when darkness came, the storm escalated to shrieking fury. The temperature dropped suddenly to 27 degrees below zero, and sleet and snow slashed the Alpena. John Deerkoff, captain of the ship Hattie Wells, which managed to make it back to Milwaukee, saw Alpena founder. He reported, "She was halfway around, and that wind just took right hold of her and turned her over." Debris started reaching Michigan shores the following day. At least 80 people died. In Michigan, that October 1880 blizzard is also known as the Alpena Storm, and it was just the beginning of the long winter. In his 1905 History of South Dakota, state historian Doane Robinson wrote, "The Great Blizzard of the middle of October 1880 was the initial performance of winter unprecedented, and never succeeded in severity in the history of Dakota or the Northwest." Professor Schell noted that although most of this early snow disappeared, heavy precipitation throughout the winter resulted in an accumulation of more than 11 feet of snow in many communities. Professor Boosted explained that there was another blizzard in November, still another starting Christmas evening. Then storm frequency increased from early January through the month of February. For the 59 days of January and February, there were just 12 days with no probable snow reported in any of the sites in the region. Otherwise, snow fell in at least one observing location on all the other days. The radio program National Notebook in 2004 explained, "There have been colder winters on the prairie and deadlier blizzards, but for sheer volume and duration of snow, that snow winter has never been rivaled." Eliza Jane Wilder wrote, "Storm followed storm. After the middle of December, I think no trains reached DeSmet, South Dakota until May." The impact on travel of the constant storms was probably the worst part. Professor Schell wrote that train service in the region was almost entirely suspended in the region by January. Railroads tried digging out the rails, only to have new storms arise and cover them again. A storm on February 2nd halted the train traffic from Sioux Falls entirely. The train did not run again until June 15th, 4.5 months later. Schell concludes, "The hardships were due not so much to low temperatures as to the privations caused by the snow blockade. Food and fuel grew scarce as connections with the outside world were cut off." Professor Boosted documented the rail closures, noting that during that gap, food and fuel could not be transported to settlers in the region via rail. Because of the abundant snowfall, overland transport also was hampered, though some travel via horse and horse-drawn sleigh was possible. By Christmas, Schell said that starvation loomed. Eliza Jane Wilder's letter wrote, "Many families were reported frozen to death, and others lived wholly on turnips, some on wheat ground in a coffee mill." The coffee mill was because of a particular problem. Even for those homesteaders who had gotten the wheat crop in, many had not had time to have it milled into flour. Families were forced to grind small amounts at a time in a coffee mill to turn it into an edible gruel or bread. Likewise, many had not had time to lay in the winter fuel supply and were forced to twist straw into blocks for fuel, a time-consuming effort that still produced inferior fuel. The impact was not just on the people. The accumulation had a significant impact on livestock. Professor Shell wrote, prairies were covered with snow so deep that cattle could not graze on the buffalo grass on which the ranchers relied for their winter feed. The snow came early in the fall and laid on the ground all winter, so deep that the cattle could not travel. Thousands of head starved to death, sometimes in sight of the hay which ranchers had put up to be fed when the cattle could not graze. Of the 3,000 head on the Cook Ranch, only 800 were left in the spring. The website Pioneer Girl wrote, many settlers wrote of finding cattle lost in the snow and suffocating or already dead. Amos Whiting found cattle that had been hit by the train heading east in DeSmet. The engineer hadn't noticed anything except snow. Shell noted that the impact on livestock changed the nature of settlement on the Great Plains, as many ranchers were obliged to close out, thus leaving the fertile prairies open to settlement by the farmers, who came a few years later. And the deprivations did not end with the spring thaw. Rather, the mass of accumulating snow, drifts as high as 11 feet were said to last the whole winter, thawed quickly, causing floods. Shell explains, when the snow finally melted in late spring of 1881, huge sections of the plains were flooded. Boosted notes, ice jam flooding arrived first, in early to mid-April, as rain fell on top of snow and ran off, swelling rivers and breaking up thick ice covering them. Newspaper editor George Washington Kingsbury wrote in his 1915 History of Dakota Territory that flooding caused by an ice dam flooded the entire town of Vermilion, South Dakota, population 600 or 700, in less than an hour. Despite flooding so bad that Shell reports that children remember parents rowing boats to town over the corn and wheat fields, the winter continued, with another blizzard striking in April. Kingsbury described one night during this long peril when a blizzard prevailed, making it impossible to row a boat or remain long exposed to the freezing blast. The house of Hans J. Hansen, located between the towns of Yankton and Vermilion, with 10 people in it, was lifted from its foundation and floated away. The occupants were able to construct a raft and escape. Floods continued through May. Eventually, Professor Boosted says, the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, as well as most of their tributaries upstream of their confluence, were swelled to record levels that stood for decades, and in a few locations, still stand as the flood of record. Some towns were relocated, others disappeared entirely. In Nebraska, the flood was so severe that it changed the course of the Missouri River. But how severe was the winter really? It's not a simple question to answer. Professor Boosted notes that meteorological data in the Central Great Plains region in the early 1880s was sparse in coverage, especially when seeking stations with long-term records that predate the hard winter and continue through the present. But Boosted was able to collect enough available data to rank the long winter on the Accumulated Winter Season Severity Index, a measure that includes temperature averages and extremes, snowfall totals, snow depth, and the duration between onset and cessation of winter weather conditions, and conclude, the long winter emerges as one of the most severe since European-descended settlers arrived to the central United States and began documenting weather. Author Den L. White concludes in his book, The Long Hard Winter of 1880-81, What Was It Like?, that it was an incredible, agonizing, awful winter. And yet in the midst of that, the pioneer spirit held through. People worked together to make sure that families had enough food. People risked their lives to travel between storms to get grain to a mill so to be ground into flour so that people could make it through the winter. Even Laura Ingalls Wilder's book concluded on a hopeful note, with the family having a belated Christmas dinner in the spring after the train was able to get through and bring food. That book finishes, spring had come, the sun was shining warm, the winds were soft, and the green grass growing. The newspaper The Black Hills Pioneer opines, if there's a lesson to be learned from the long winter, it's that times can be tough, but good times will come again. The winter of 1888 had been so mild on the U.S. East Coast, the mildest in nearly 2 decades, that by early March the trees were already beginning to bud. The robins were returning to the city. It was more than 50 degrees. It was so clearly the coming of spring that in March 10th, Walt Whitman, by then 78 years old, living in New Jersey, and the most celebrated poet in the country, if not the world, submitted a poem, a quaint, beautiful poem about the coming of spring called The First Dandelion, to the New York Herald for publication. Simple and fresh and fair from winter's close emerging, as if no artifice of fashion, business, politics had ever been, forth from its sunny nook of sheltered grass, innocent, golden, calm as the dawn, the spring's first dandelion shows its trustful face. The poem was published on March 12th. By then, it was comically ill-timed. The great blizzard of 1888 struck March 11th. The weather had, previous to the blizzard, been unseasonably warm, resulting in heavy rains. When cold Arctic air ran into the warm, wet air from the Gulf, temperatures plummeted, and the rain turned to snow. The result did not just create mounds of snow, up to 50 inches, but sustained high winds that earned the storm the moniker, the Great White Hurricane. The nation's weather service, then under the auspices of the Army Signal Corps, knew of the winter storm coming from the west and the warm, wet front coming from the Gulf, but had predicted that both would be spent before reaching the east coast. The weather forecast for March 11th was light rain. The people had no warning at all. The storm was in full swing on March 12th, yet many New Yorkers still set off for work. There were no worker benefits at the time to pay for days off for snow, and surely the trains would keep running. No one seemed prepared for what was to come. The commuter trains at the time were on elevated rails. They were first stalled due to ice and slick rails, with their small engines unable to find traction. Then by the depth of the snow, and finally by the accidents, as the trains that were still moving were unable to stop and collided with those that were not. Thousands of people were stranded in trains and stations. Enterprising New Yorkers brought out long ladders and charged a small fee to get people down from the elevated trains. The snow fell deep enough that the streetcars came off their tracks, and that service, too, was halted. As transportation was at a standstill, Roscoe Conkling, a former U.S. Senator and aspiring presidential candidate, still very fit and hale at the age of 58, set out on March 12th from his office to walk the 3 miles to his home. He found himself stuck in Central Park with snow up to his arms. He described it as near giving right up and sinking down there to die as a man can do, and not do it. It took him 3 hours to walk those 3 miles to safety. A harrowing tale, but not the end of the story. He contracted pneumonia and died 6 days later. Conkling was likely the most famous victim of the storm, but certainly not the only one. The Philadelphia Times detailed several of those lost. While the 23rd District officer was on his beat during the height of the storm yesterday morning, information was given him that the dead body of a woman had been found in a snowdrift just across the Delaware County line. It was supposed to be the body of a woman in a habit of gathering fern and mint leaves during the summer months, and from the appearance of the body, the presumption is that she was frozen to death. George Chrisman, a lightman at the signal tower near Saratoga, was run down by the Williamsport Express near Saratoga and instantly killed this morning. He had just been relieved from duty and was on his way home. The wind was blowing a gale, and he was blinded by the snow, and a train ran into him. A large pine tree on the north side of Christian Street fell to the ground, borne down by a large weight of frozen snow. A young lad named Joseph Brown was clearing the pavement when one of the branches struck him on the head. Harry Dreers, a Philadelphia and Reading coal train brakeman, was knocked from his train near Pottstown and fatally injured. The young man was standing on top of a boxcar when he was blinded by the snow and struck by an overhead bridge and thrown down on the tracks. The Boston Globe reported Robert H. Masterson, age 66, of Tuckahoe, was one of the passengers aboard a train which got stalled in a cut between Mount Vernon and Williamsbridge on Monday night. After being in the train several hours, Masterson, with a number of other passengers, started to walk towards the nearest station. He got separated from the other passengers and fell in the snow, exhausted. When his body was found, it was frozen stiff. He leaves a wife and 5 children. The Chicago Tribune reported a story from Elizabethport, New Jersey. Alexander Bennett, John Lee, and another employee of the Singer Sewing Machine Company left Elizabethport Monday in a small rowboat for Staten Island. The empty boat was found in the ice, far out of its course. It is thought the men reached Staten Island shore, but perished while crossing the meadow. The great blizzard of 1888 had, in fact, the highest death toll of any winter storm in U.S. history. In all, the storm and cold killed some 400 people along the coast from the mouth of the Chesapeake into Canada, 200 of those in New York City. The blizzard struck a vast swath of the east. The Philadelphia Times wrote, not only did it strike here, but it reached over Jersey, New York, and way down into Maine. Telegraph communication was almost entirely cut off midnight Sunday, but it was learned that the blizzard extended west to Ohio and south below Washington. As for Philadelphia, the paper said the storm was undoubtedly the worst chronicled in the last 50 years. It's thought to be the most severe of any known in the history of the Quaker City. The Morning Journal Courier of New Haven, Connecticut reported a veritable blizzard, the most terrible storm ever witnessed in this latitude. The Sacramento, California Record Union reported the effect on the nation's capital. The storm that visited Washington yesterday was one of the most remarkable for years. In fact, the capital seemed to have been the center of a miniature cyclone that brought with it a blinding succession of rain, snow, wind, and cold. News of the storm even reached across the ocean, with the Yorkshire Herald of North Yorkshire, England, noting, "The Stock Exchange, for the first time in its history, stopped business by a formal resolution, after it had already been stopped less formally, and without a resolution, by the blizzard and the snow." The blizzard was unique. The snowfall totals were not near records for the U.S. Northeast previously or since. The temperature lows were likewise no record, nor were the winds. What made the Great White Blizzard of 1888 unique was the unique combination of snow, wind, and cold, all at the same time. Snow drifted so high that in some places it covered fifth-floor windows. Hundreds of ships foundered or ran aground in the storm. Some 100 of the victims who died were sailors. More died because efforts to fight the cold led to fires, and the fire departments were unable to respond. Still, people managed to carry on. Trapped in anyway, the Ringling Brothers Circus performed 2 shows in Madison Square Garden as scheduled, mostly to people who were stranded and seeking shelter. While the Great Blizzard of '88 was one to remember, its impact was larger than other, statistically more powerful storms. The growing, thriving metropolises of the East at the time, now lit with electricity, connected by telegraphs, served by trains, heated by gas, had, in their modernization, become surprisingly vulnerable, as all of these were above the ground. The Baltimore Sun reported that telephone and telegraph wires and poles, weighted down with ice, were easily broken or overthrown. Trees were torn up by the roots, and railroads were blockaded by the snowdrifts. The downfall of telegraph wires cut off the city from communication with other points, and news was either delayed or completely lost. The Philadelphia Times wrote that railroad travel was almost entirely suspended. West Philadelphia was isolated from the center of the city as completely as if it were miles away, and the capital of the nation has been isolated from the world for the past 24 hours. New York was as far from Washington as before electric telegraphy was known. The Chicago Tribune provided a stark example. The best evidence of the complete isolation of New York today is the fact that telegraphs from Boston to the city were received this afternoon via the Atlantic cable from England, having been sent under the ocean to Europe and thence to New York. In no other way could access be gained to the city. In fact, the electricity wires, broken by heavy ice and high winds, were one of the greatest dangers to city dwellers. The storm drew comparisons to the West, which had suffered a terrific storm in January, which had killed several children in the plains and upper Midwest as they tried to make it home from school, earning the moniker the Children's Blizzard. The Philadelphia Times reported a comparison from someone with experience on the subject. Signal Service Officer Prender said, "I have served 15 years in Dakota in the Signal Service Department, and I have seen some pretty bad blizzards. And I can assure you, this one was a pretty bad one. This has been a genuine Dakota blizzard, and the worst you ever saw in this part of the country." Several papers wrote about citizens from the West sending aid, but the Black Hills Weekly Journal of Rapid City, Dakota Territory, couldn't help but take a swipe at their eastern brethren. While Dakota is basking in sunshine brighter than the East ever knows, New York is shivering amid the storms of winter, and yet the Eastern people presume to speak of the West as a bleak, inhospitable country. They know nothing of the West. As the people dug their way out from under the snow, their sense of resiliency and humor was shown. The Chicago Tribune wrote on March 15th that on Broadway the sidewalks were cleaned, and all sorts of humorous signs were stuck up in the snow piles, such as, "Keep off the grass," "You can have it if you will take it away," and the familiar Central Park notice, "Do not touch a leaf or a flower." Notably, one of the signs, the paper noticed, made an ironic reference to Whitman's poem. One had stuck up what he called the Blizzard Gazette, and under the titles were these lines of poetry. "Oh, where is the poet who wrote of the spring, and the birds, and the flowers, and the trees? They have hustled him off to the cold, cold north, and left him there to freeze." More than any other single event, the blizzard of '88 drove cities to move their utility lines and wires underground. It was a large motivation behind the building of the nation's first subway systems, including the nation's very first system, opened in Boston in 1897. The Great White Hurricane changed the very nature of a modern city. It is March 15th, 2023, and there's some severe weather in the United States right now. Another one of those atmospheric rivers is pounding the west coast, while powerful nor'easter pounds the east. That really shouldn't surprise us. Severe weather often occurs in March in the United States. In fact, some of the worst blizzards in U.S. history occurred in March, including the 1888 Great Blizzard and the 1993 Storm of the Century. And another one of those terrible March blizzards, fast-moving Alberta Clipper that struck the northern plains, North Dakota, Minnesota, and Saskatchewan on March 15, 1941, moved so quickly that it stranded thousands of people and killed more than 100. The 1941 Ides of March blizzard deserves to be remembered. The storm struck with little warning. United Academics magazine wrote in 2017. The weather forecast predicted snow precipitation and low temperatures for that night, but there were no mentions of an aggravation of the climate conditions, let alone a blizzard warning. In fact, it was a surprisingly pleasant day for the northern plains in March, drawing people out. United Academics continues. The region awoke with a little taste of the springtime that was about to come. The day was cold but shiny, and the snow was melting. For North Dakota residents, it looked like the perfect day to be out of their houses and forget the chill winter and the bombs blowing up all over Europe. In 2018, the Dickinson, North Dakota Press quoted a story about the blizzard told to Connie Kirpus-Hannison of Crookston, Minnesota, by her father Edward. March 15th dawned a beautiful warm day, hinting at the approach of spring. Following a long, hard winter that had begun with the Armistice Day blizzard, many had cabin fever and took advantage of the sunshiny day to be out and about. Little did anyone know that the worst blizzard of the century was only hours away. The Hope, North Dakota Pioneer wrote on March 20th, 1941, that quite a number of farmers were caught in town. Some had come to shop, others to attend a show. So when the storm struck, people were simply unprepared. The Pioneer continued, striking with sudden fury and continuing for hours. The worst storm in years visited the section of the country Saturday night, bringing death and destruction. The storm struck Hope about 8 in the evening. Following a pleasant day that no indication that a storm was brewing, some warning had been given over the radio that a strong wind was coming, but not many people paid any serious attention to it, as wind is not an uncommon thing in North Dakota. Meteorologist Daryl Richardson told the Dickinson Press, because it was a warm day, people were not dressed for a winter storm. But when the storm came, it came fast. A personal blog called St. Vincent, Minnesota Memories writes, at 7:24 p.m. on Saturday, March 15th, the wind in Pembina, North Dakota, was at 36 miles per hour. But 10 minutes later, it jumped to 58 miles per hour. Pembina immediately warned the Fargo Airport station of the drastic change. This was the first report Fargo had received that a dangerous storm had arrived in northeastern North Dakota. Weather historian Bill Murray wrote in a 2014 edition of the Alabama Weather blog, across North Dakota and Minnesota, temperatures dropped 20 degrees in 15 minutes in many places as Arctic air moved in. The fast-moving storm brought 50-mile-per-hour sustained winds to a wide area, and 85-mile-per-hour wind gusts were recorded in Grand Forks. Whiteout conditions were recorded as what would be known as the Ides of March blizzard raged. The speed of the storm was the result of a specific kind of weather system. Reader's Digest Canada explains. It was a devastating type of snowstorm called an Alberta Clipper, a fast-moving cold front swooping in from the Rockies that brought whiteout conditions and ferocious wind chills of minus 45 degrees Celsius out of nowhere. The website of Farmer's Almanac writes that Alberta Clipper is a name coined to describe a fast-moving storm system that sweeps down across the northern plains and Great Lakes regions of the United States from, you guessed it, Alberta, Canada, or thereabouts, anyway. Alberta Clippers can actually originate from nearby Manitoba, Saskatchewan, or even the state of Montana to the south. And explains that Alberta Clippers are caused by low-pressure systems that form when warm winds from the Pacific Ocean collide with the colder air over the Rocky Mountains. The term clipper is a reference to the speed of these storms. The almanac continues. Because of their speed, Alberta Clippers often swoop in with little warning. The storms take their name from the Clippers, sleek, agile merchant sailing vessels popular during the 19th century and designed for speed. The term is apt, and the weather phenomenon was well demonstrated in the Ides of March blizzard. The website of Prairie Public Radio notes that in western North Dakota, the temperature suddenly dropped from 33 to 70 degrees below zero, and winds picked up to 40 miles per hour. The Dickinson, North Dakota Press wrote that as sudden as the dropping of a curtain, a black fog of churning dust and snow blinded the prairies for 1,000 miles. The wind was the most shocking part of the storm. Connie Kirpus Hannison told the Dickinson Press that her father remembered the winds, estimated to 80 to 85 miles per hour, sounded like a freight train hitting the house. The Regina, Saskatchewan Leader Post told the story of a Northside store manager who went to pick up his wife in the storm. As he went outside, his hat blew off. On his way back, while driving under the Broad Street subway, he saw a hat resting on the road. He stopped and picked it up. It was one that he had lost an hour earlier and blocks away. The Evening Herald wrote that little snow accompanied the terrific wind, but what there was became packed into rock-like drifts in many places. Recorded wind velocity included one of 74 miles an hour at Fargo and another of 68 miles per hour at Grand Forks, both in North Dakota. Sudden gusts at times raised the gale as much as 15 miles per hour. Such sudden winds could be deadly on their own. The Hagerstown, Maryland Daily Mail reported that North Dakota authorities reported that in a number of instances, storm victims were suffocated by the sheer force of the wind, their lungs congested with the snow and dirt-filled air. The suddenness of the storm meant that many were trapped, unable to travel home. The Omaha, Nebraska Evening Herald writes that thousands were forced to spend most of the night in theaters and other amusement places Saturday night because police forbade them to go out in the storm. About 3,000 farmers who went to Moorhead, Minnesota to hear an address by an Agricultural Adjustment Administration administrator were forced to stay there the night. 2,000 spectators attending a basketball tournament at Moorhead State had to stay in the junior high school gymnasium, and competing teams played throughout the night. The Daily Mail reported that theaters, hotels, and stores in the population centers in the storm area remained open all night to accommodate thousands of farmers and their families marooned in towns. Many others were trapped in their cars. The Halleck, Minnesota Kitson County Enterprise reported that all of a sudden the wind switched to the northwest and struck with such a violent fury, and within an instant's time the entire scene was transformed into a raging blizzard as the thermometer started to plunge downward as though it had been plunged into a cake of ice. The fury of the storm was such that persons driving were simply trapped and stopped in their tracks. The Buffalo New York News reported that dozens of cars plunged into ditches driven there by the wind. Others slipped from the road as fine snow and dust, swirled by the gale, cut visibility to nothing. The Winnipeg Tribune wrote that hundreds of automobiles were abandoned Saturday night along highways throughout the stricken area. The Hope Pioneer reported that the Hope Junior High basketball team was trapped by the storm. H.R. Eastman started out with the team and got within 2 or 3 miles of Findlay when the storm struck them. In an effort to reach town, Mr. Eastman had 2 of the boys walk ahead of the car, but little progress was made, and this was abandoned. The team spent the night out in the car. As long as the gas held out, the heater kept them from getting cold. When their feet started to chill, they took their shoes off and sat on each other's feet. The team was rescued in the morning, but others were not so lucky. The website of the History Channel writes that most of the victims of the blizzard were traveling in their cars when it hit. Highway 2, running from Duluth, Minnesota to North Dakota, was shut down, as were Highways 75 and 81. Attempts to rescue those stranded in their cars came too late. In one incident, 6-year-old Wilbert Treichel died from exposure to the cold as his parents attempted to carry him through the blizzard to safety. The Buffalo News writes that some of the victims froze to death in their stalled cars. Others were battered to exhaustion as they sought to fight their way to safety and froze to death on roads and in fields. The Daily Mail wrote that Mrs. Peter Bjerken, about 45, and her son Palmer, 8, died from exhaustion near Manhoman, Minnesota, after they started out from their stalled automobile with a husband and another son who made their way to safety. And a companion of Frances Waters, about 21, who perished when she started to walk from their stranded car near Kelso, North Dakota, still was sought today. The Buffalo News reported that Sid Boname, the railroad station agent in Tilden, North Dakota, bundled his wife and small child in blankets while he went for aid after their car slipped from the road. Mrs. Boname and the child were rescued the next day, but Mr. Boname froze to death. Stories were almost legion of men dying to save their families, the Buffalo News wrote. The Grand Forks Herald also lists the Foss family of Beltrami, North Dakota. The mail carrier would find the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Foss and their 14-year-old daughter, Rosalind, huddled together down in the ditch. They had evidently attempted to seek refuge from the blustery winds after abandoning their car. The Omaha Herald reported that 4 boys, Lee, Donald, Dickie, and Robert Taylor of Daisy, North Dakota, left their stalled car.
Lost and freezing, Lee, 17, and Donald, 15, buried their twin 10-year-old brothers in a snowdrift, hoping to keep them alive and search for help. The Buffalo News reported that Robert Taylor was rescued, huddled in a snowdrift with his twin brother Dickie, who died just after a search party reached them. It was a feeble wave of the dying Dickie's arms, the news writes, that attracted rescuers to the spot after they'd found the bodies of the two other brothers nearby. Author Larry Scrotch, author of the 1992 book on the blizzard entitled Looking for Candles in the Window, the tragic Red River Valley blizzard of March 15, 1941, told the Grand Forks Herald, "Growing up, we always heard from our parents that if something happens, don't leave your vehicle. Don't leave your vehicle. We think it's because of the 1941 blizzard that they remember. A lot of people that died in that storm were people that tried to walk off to safety, but the few people who stayed in their cars, they survived that storm." The Omaha Daily Mail reported that in the Fargo, North Dakota Moorhead area, it was believed prompt action of the police and highway authorities averted more serious consequences there by halting highway traffic shortly after the storm broke. The blinding storm made for a terrifying form of tragedy. The Buffalo News notes that in many cases, bodies were found only a short distance from shelter. Prairie Public reported that out near Wing, Emil Dickinson hitched a ride partway home with a neighbor. Living only 2 miles from town, Erickson got out to walk the last mile. The storm came on so suddenly, he lost his way and died, just 200 feet from his farmhouse. The Grand Forks Herald wrote at the time that Mrs. Orland Bailey left her family's car with her ailing husband and children inside to check on another stalled car just 20 feet away, and the furious wind swept her away in the swirling, blinding blizzard. Walking some 3.5 miles in the storm, cold and exhaustion overtook her. She sank down into a 5 or 6 foot space between two small unused buildings on the Minnie Ross farm, almost within a stone's throw of the warm house and safety. Just another 100 yards, and Mrs. Orland Bailey of Hibbing, Minnesota, might be alive today, the article read. The Omaha Herald wrote that Albert Jacobson, 73, a farmer, and his son Albert Jr., 11, were found dead, clinging to a barbed wire fence only a short distance from their home near Fort Ransom, North Dakota. They had attempted to follow the fence to their farmyard. Prairie Public writes that Harry Weiner and his wife made it to the driveway of their farm, but when they got out of the car, the wind swept away the 8-year-old, and her parents ran to catch her. They lost their bearings, but finally came across a fence. Weiner got his wife and children into his sheep barn, but Mrs. Weiner died. The Montreal, Quebec Gazette reported that 57-year-old Saskatchewan farmer Fred Ebel, a father of 8, froze to death while trying to return home after he had driven to the town of Weyburn to get some medicine for his wife. His body was found Sunday morning, a mile from home, the paper wrote. Among the 6 people who died in Canada in the storm were Mrs. John Jansen, 43, and her 6-year-old daughter, found dead in a snowdrift. Some of the deaths were particularly heart-wrenching. Sisters Katie and Florence Howry, 21 and 15 years old, apparently went out in the storm to search for their mother, not knowing that she was safe. The 2 froze to death along railroad tracks near Pembina. The Omaha World Herald writes that a train ran over them before their bodies were noticed. But in the storm, there were some amazing stories of survival. The Grand Forks Herald writes that H.A. Bond of Edna, Minnesota, survived the blizzard after walking some 3 miles with a group of friends. The car the group of 7 were in went into a ditch in the blinding snow. Wearing only light jackets, they walked through the storm, arms locked. He told the Herald in 2016, "We turned around, 3 in front, 4 behind. We locked arms and walked towards Langdon. It was so bad we couldn't see the ones in front. We would hit their heels when we were walking. It was a bugger. You couldn't see anything. The only thing that really saved us was the blacktop road that we were on. We'd get blown off the road and have to work our way back. The snow was packed in underneath our jackets so tight that we'd stay warm. The group made it safely to a gas station in the town of Langdon." The Buffalo News reported that 1 feat of rescue was performed by a Great Northern Railway crew. The train made an emergency stop when they saw a man waving from a stalled car. In all, the train crew rescued 8 people from stalled vehicles. All those rescued went to hospitals, the paper reports. The Hagerstown, Maryland Daily Mail wrote that 10 passengers on the Northland Greyhound bus stalled east of Petersburg, North Dakota, made their way to a farmhouse. And that 4 University of North Dakota students linked arms to form a human chain and rescued marooned Ottawaist near their fraternity house. They rescued 12 persons. The Dickinson, North Dakota Press wrote in 2018 that the Ides of March blizzard, March 15th to 17th, 1941, was among the worst in Red River Valley history and among the most disastrous ever nationwide.
In all, 151 people were killed by the storm. Prior to the storm, weather forecasters in North Dakota and Minnesota were under the control of the Chicago Weather Office. And the Alabama Weather blog notes that critics rightfully claim that the Chicago office was more interested in local conditions than they were about conditions in the places that were affected by the storm. After the storm, those local forecasters were given more autonomy, and combined with improved weather forecasting techniques, today it is much less likely that people can be so blindsided by such a storm. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop and book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.